Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Critical Underrepresented Business Support Grants RFP pre-application webinar. Please know that we will be recording this session. If you do not want to be recorded, please turn off your camera. And this info webinar recording and associated slides will be posted to our website after the presentation. We will be answering all questions posed both via chat and verbally at the end of the presentation. Until time for Q&A, please self-mute your microphones to reduce possible disturbances. And finally, if you'd like to connect with others on the call, please add your name, organization, and email to the partnership document that will be linked in the chat. Thank you all for being here. We're going to get started. Next slide, please. Quick overview of today's agenda. We'll review background information on this RFP opportunity. We'll review the hub and spoke model, including funding details, eligibility, selection criteria, and expectations for both hubs and spokes. And we'll review the application process and timeline. We will be only answering questions at the end of the presentation. We do have limited time today, so if we do not get to your question, please know that we have numerous office hour sessions where you can meet with Mass CEC staff and ask any questions you still have after the presentation. We will review the office hour dates about halfway through the presentation, and they are on our website as well. Next slide, please. So here on this slide, if you'd like to follow along, you can find a direct link to the CUBS RFP. CUBS is the acronym we're using for Climate Critical Underrepresented Business Support. The goal of this RFP is to support the growth of underrepresented businesses in climate critical field. And the next few slides will review funding sources, areas of impact, and priority populations. You can use the QR code or you can find the RFP through the Mass CEC website. Next slide, please. Quickly to review, Mass CEC's work spans 4 main areas of climate impact. As seen below, we have climate tech innovation and investment, accelerating decarbonization, large-scale development in offshore wind, and clean energy and climate workforce development as represented by this opportunity and other open workforce RFPs. Our goal is to grow a diverse and talented clean energy workforce to ensure a sustainable future for all. Next slide, please. So today I'm joined by several Mass CEC workforce development team members. I am Jenna Wills. I'm a senior program manager here at Mass CEC. I'm joined today by Edward Shea, Heather Marciniak, Anitra Ford, Kira Nolan, and Maeve Singer. Thank you all for being here. If you do need to touch base with any of us, feel free to send us an email or to reach out in the chat. We are available and willing to support however we can. Next slide, please. So reviewing the funding that allows this RFP to be possible. This RFP is an outcome of the Workforce Equity Fund, which was established in 2021 by Massachusetts legislature, setting aside $12 million annually to support the clean energy sector and, as mentioned, ensuring an equitable and inclusive industry in Massachusetts. Mass CEC does this by supporting underrepresented businesses within the clean energy sector and that are expanding and hiring as they grow. In conjunction, we work to increase job pipelines in clean energy occupations. Next slide, please. And to further expand on this point, as described in the previous slide, the Equity Workforce Program was initially created through the March 2021 climate legislation, an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, and redefined by the August 2022 climate legislation, an act driving clean energy and workforce wind. The program supports, among other opportunities, workforce training for certified minority-owned and women-owned small business enterprises and other businesses or communities underrepresented in the clean energy workforce or clean energy industry. This can also be viewed on page 4 of the RFP. Next slide, please. And going through some of the language that's found in the RFP, specifically on page 21, you can learn more about the definition of an underrepresented business, but the underrepresented business definition that we share here is a business that is at least 51% owned and operated by an individual or group that is part of a traditionally underrepresented or underserved group. Again, this information can be found on page 21 of the CUBS RFP. The State Supplier Diversity Office promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion by contracting and in state contracting and certifies diverse small mass businesses. And you can see below the various certifications that a business can have in the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. For the purpose of this RFP, an example of an underrepresented business is an MWBE, or a minority and women-owned business enterprise, of which 51% of the business is owned and dominantly controlled by minority or women principals. The theory of change being that the more MWBEs that exist, it will increase the uptick of individuals being hired from diverse backgrounds. At the same time, we recognize that many of the most impacted populations are those that need these opportunities to grow their generational wealth. And this is a great way of doing that by supporting those businesses in a sector where there is great opportunity. Next slide, please. And the primary target population of this RFP are MWBEs. However, we encourage you to partner with organizations that are from the populations listed here. The first target population listed is individuals that live in environmental justice neighborhoods. These individuals are disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change. And the bullets outline what is legislated as meeting the criteria for an EJ neighborhood. The QR code will also link you to an interactive map that you can dial into specific neighborhoods around the Commonwealth and see whether they are EJ communities or not. Also included in the target population are members of federally designated or state acknowledged tribes, members of underrepresented communities in the clean energy workforce, and current or former workers from the fossil fuel industry. I'm going to pass it over to Edward for the next section of our presentation.
Thank you, Jenna. Next slide, please. There. So on page 15 of the RFP, we go over the different climate critical sectors with examples of types of businesses and occupations that are within those sectors. If you go to the next slide, the important thing to call out with the CUBS RFP is that we are very much focusing in on businesses that are involved in the design, manufacture, installation, and maintenance of clean energy projects, particularly around decarbonization. So that means there are businesses that are doing architecture and design of these projects, or they may be involved in the supply chain leading to, for example, heat pumps, or you may have solar installers that are looking to grow their businesses, their capacity to do more projects in the field. Or you may have some small electrician businesses trying to pivot and do more EV installs and make. Next slide, please. So a general overview of this particular RFP, there is 4.4 million available this round. Applications are due April 25th, and later on in the webinar, we'll go over the specific steps that have to be taken to submit an application. The overarching goal of RFP is to pivot the existing business support ecosystem that MassDC has built over the last 2.5 years and pivot it into the hub and spoke model so that we can ensure that there's a uniform and accessible system out there for all businesses across the Commonwealth that are looking to get into the clean energy sector. So as mentioned, one of the big benefits of the hub and spoke model that we'll be talking about more in depth later is the fact that whether you're in Western Mass or whether you're in Boston, you'll know that you'll be able to access a basic core level of service. In addition, calling back to the previous slide, we want to very much focus in and make sure that this is a clean energy hub and spoke ecosystem. So again, specifically are looking for business participants to be served, and those businesses should be in the design, manufacture, install, and maintenance of decarbonization projects. The other benefits that we'll gain from this opportunity, a little bit enhanced coordination that will lead to the ability to do coordinated recruiting, marketing, and outreach, which will benefit everyone, both MassCC, the participants, and the support organizations that are potentially going to be hubs. This all still will allow us to be regionally responsive, as we know the needs of participants in Western Mass to Eastern Mass very much differ, and the opportunities very much differ depending on location as well. Next slide. So the hub and spoke models, we are specifically looking to have a hub over the time in each of the 7 workforce skills cabinet regions, which is shown on the map on the right. You can see the sort of imaginary hub and spokes building out in those regions. That's strictly at this point hypothetical, but the idea is that you have a larger centralized spoke, a hub that will provide baseline core services and do a lot of the coordination across the region, while you have spokes arrayed around that hub that are focused a little bit more on sector-specific services such as procurement navigation and more specialized certifications and licenses. Next slide, please. So in terms of applicants, we are agnostic on who should be the lead applicant, but the list of entities you can see on the top right are the entities that are eligible within Massachusetts. The big callouts are that the lead applicant has to have a Massachusetts-based office or staffing. They must be in good standing with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they also must be in good standing with Mass CC. In general, applications that come in that are focused on only serving a single business or several small businesses and not an ecosystem of businesses will not be viewed as favorably. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about the RFP goals. Generally, the program goals as a whole for our funding source and for the system once it's set up is to increase MWBs and underrepresented businesses in those 4 climate critical sectors, especially around, again, the install, maintenance, manufacture, and design of decarbonization projects. We are hoping this will enable us to grow and create new MWB and underrepresented firms in the sector and bridge gaps where there are current gaps in the system, as there is a fairly robust small business support system in the state, but pivoting that system to bear and support climate critical businesses is key to the success both of our underrepresented business support system as well as our current career pathway training programs, which are trying to off-ramp and get individuals from underrepresented communities hired in the clean energy ecosystem. Next slide, please. So there are many key things you should consider when you're designing a program, but just to call out a few things that we'll be looking for in particular. The design of your program should be designed to support underrepresented businesses that are specific to their challenges. So we are looking at both in terms of sector-specific acknowledgement and responsiveness, as well as responsiveness to the scale of businesses you plan on supporting, and making sure that the business model you propose to us fits both the scale and type of businesses you are hoping to support. We do, while we cannot, support lobbying or advocacy, we do support organizations that go out there and address both the supply and demand side of the barriers. As we know, there are some barriers to businesses getting into the clean energy sector that are, in the system, and those will require coordination and collaboration with the procurement decision makers, whether that be a state organization or a private organization. In addition to that, kind of calling back to the first bullet, again, you will have to have a service flow, and we expect that service flow to be responsive and recognize the different needs of the types and sizes of businesses that you plan on supporting. Next slide, please. So here's a quick look. We'll discuss further later the types, the ways of applying, but real quickly, there are 2 types of application in this RFP. There's an application specific for those who are seeking to become a hub, one of those 7 hubs in the region. And there's a separate application packet for those seeking to become a spoke. And you can see there's a different threshold of maximum funding for both. A little asterisk by the 800,000 for the hubs is calling out the fact that if you are a hub applicant, you will also be required to submit a separate packet to be a spoke as well. And the 800,000 total should cover both amounts for both of those applications. So if you're applying 600,000 to your hub, the maximum you can apply to be a spoke for would be 200,000 under that accompanying application. And again, to emphasize, if you're applying to be a hub, you will need to submit a separate procurement navigation spoke application. There's nothing stopping the hub applicant from submitting additional spoke applications or vice versa Applicants can submit as many as they feel are appropriate, and we will judge them accordingly. Next slide, please. So, as messaged by the fact that they're two separate application packets, hubs and spokes have different roles, but there are also many shared roles and responsibilities. There are more on the chart on page 11, if you refer to the RFP. But here are some quick high-level priorities: case management and tracking, for example. So while hub's main role will be leading that case management and focusing on managing the cross referrals to the spokes, spokes as well will have to keep track of those who are referred to them and report up to the hubs as progress occurs with those participants. So there is a joint responsibility there to keep track of participants if they go from a hub to spoke or vice versa. Same thing, a hub has the responsibility of coordinating with centralized reporting, the cross referrals, but spokes have to collaborate with those hubs to make sure that that all comes to play, and it'll benefit everyone if everyone's working together. And in fact, there will be a requirement of contracting the hubs and spokes work together. Next page, next slide, please. So real quick, the way we anticipate this to happen is we have, right now we're in the March to June initial period where we're waiting for your applications that will come in April. We'll do a review, and then close to the end of the fiscal year, we'll make our initial awards. And then throughout the remainder of the fiscal year, we will be working with those awardees to stand up their contracts, design their initial rollouts, and at the same time, we'll be looking to release additional funds. And then as we go forward, we'll continue refining this RFP process and fill in gaps where needed. We anticipate this is going to be a process since this is a major pivot into a new model. So at this stage, I believe I hand it over to Heather.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to look at selection criteria. Proposals submitted in response to this solicitation will be reviewed by Mass EC, including both a screening and a review by committee. And we're going to look at some of that selection criteria from the RFP in the next few slides. Next slide. So the most competitive applications will not only explain their proposed service delivery backed up by research and why they chose that intervention, but will also explain the processes. For example, a clearly defined service workflow from intake to outcomes, as well as a budget and program phases that align with the narrative proposed in your application. Next slide. So here are some of the selection criteria directly from the RFP on page 30 that I mentioned. So moving left to right, we're going to be looking for an applicant to clearly define the climate critical businesses that they're focusing on and the type of underrepresented businesses. For example, a spoke might be focused on businesses at a very specific and certain scale. We want applicants to present clear delivery and dosage models for each of the service service or training offerings, including defining the staff and the partner roles and responsibilities. Next slide. The review committee will also look at the service delivery proposed. Applicants should have a clear accounting of the services and trainings to be offered under each of the core service buckets. For example, if you're applying as a hub. The review committee will also look at how services and training delivery progress businesses towards becoming business ready. And that will be signaled by the performance metrics the applicants include. Reviewers will look at those outcomes both in the application narrative, but applicants also want to ensure that the outcomes, the performance metrics they're including are also filled out by the number in the budget forms. And later on in the presentation, we'll go over those budget forms. Next slide. So we've mentioned that we would expect the review committee will be reviewing applications, and the expectation is that proposed program will include a service plan workflow. This is just an example, but a service plan workflow will typically include, but doesn't have to be limited to, marketing and outreach to recruit underrepresented businesses, defined intake and assessment processes to assess and confirm eligibility, the administration of business assessments so that the hub or spoke are able to tailor the services, the delivery of services. For example, the core services. Again, we don't expect that all businesses coming to a hub in a certain region will necessarily require to receive all of the core services, but we do expect there to be business assessments to confirm where those needs are. And then additionally, there should be managed referrals to and from the spokes. And everyone should be able to graduate participants when they're business ready, but also provide retention and follow-up to ensure continued success of those businesses, including referrals back to needed services if that's identified. Of course, core services can be part of the broader service plan of a spoke. During the business assessment phase of the delivery of spoke services, you also want to ensure that you're providing, for example, the back office support or the financial planning needed by your business participant. Next slide. So now we're going to take a more in-depth look at the expectations just for the hub. Next slide. So main elements of the hub. Obviously, they're serving as regional anchors. You're acting as the primary coordinating body responsible for the administration, oversight, monitoring, outcomes of the core services. So as a result, hubs must have the staffing capacity to take on that level of responsibility. You're going to provide the core services. Again, we understand that not all business participants may need every core service, but they should be offered so that they can be part of the service plan offered based on the needs decided during the business assessment. And again, a hub is also, in addition to providing the core service buckets or categories, they're also going to be providing procurement navigation through at least one sector. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Next slide, please. So 2 points on that last note. Why are hub applicants required to submit a separate spoke application? Why separately? Well, one, we want to ensure that the 7 regional hubs across the Commonwealth are focused on clean energy and expansion of the clean energy sector. So any business coming to hub will not only get that back office support or that other core support they need, but they'll also get support navigating the clean energy sectors, so at least one of the clean energy sectors. Additionally, this is the first RFP as we pivot to the new hub and spoke program delivery model. So we realize that some applicants may still be exploring their role within this model, and we want to ensure that applicants have the flexibility to be considered under both application types, both funding priorities. Next slide. So going back to the core services by hubs, these are the 6 categories, the buckets that are required: operations, business development, network access, certification, financial planning, and management. Again, we understand that not every business will necessarily need support under every category. Again, also, the examples provided under these 6 categories are just examples. We want this model to be regionally responsive, and hub applicants can propose the services and training they think are priorities for their region under these 6 categories. You'll see we've put the procurement navigation under network access. A regional hub will, be expected to provide some access to networking in the clean energy sectors. But again, the specific subsector procurement navigation is kind of going to come in under a separate spoke application. Next slide. So we're going to take a few slides to look more specifically at the spokes. Again, a spoke will be a specialized service provider providing services designed to overcome sector-specific barriers for business. So we want the spokes to be taking our businesses one step closer to being business ready and securing contracts through procurement navigation. Therefore, it's necessary to focus on a sector. That's why we say a sector specific, and that's why a hub is required to at least focus on one sector. Again, a focus on procurement opportunities in building decarbonation, clean transportation, net zero grid, offshore wind. We want to see a focus on underrepresented business that directly participate, as Edward already mentioned, in the design, manufacturing, installation, and maintenance of clean energy projects under those subsectors. Next slide. So here are some spoke elements. I want to call it that I expect to get this question. Spokes can submit an application covering multiple regions, as long as it's one sector, right? If the work does not significantly vary per region under one sector. But if you are even choosing one sector, but you do think that the work will necessitate a very different service plan based on the region, then it might be wiser to submit separate applications. But again, if you were going to do one subsector and you wanted to provide services in 3 regions, you could submit one application covering those 3 regions. If you were a hub and you wanted to, just to call back, if you were a hub and you wanted to provide services in different regions, that would of course require separate applications. So spokes, should not be providing only the equivalent of the core services. That's why we have the hubs in every region accessible by underrepresented businesses across the Commonwealth. But of course, core services can be part of the broader service plan, the access to comprehensive services of a spoke, because you can refer your participants back to the hubs for those services. But to do that, you're going to need the case management that connects to a cross-referral system managed by the hub, and that's going to need to be outlined in your service work plan. Next slide. So on that note, while the spokes are providing specialized program delivery, there is going to be a lot of overlap between the type of information that both a spoke and a hub applicant will be required to fill out on their applications. So spokes, just like hubs, are going to have to provide information on their capability statement, the intake and assessment processes, as well as a business assessment. So, they're tailoring the support to the type of business they're supporting, and the case management, because if you don't have the case management, how do you know when to refer back your business participant back to the hub for core services? And again, even after you graduate a business, you want to be providing some retention services for a year so that you are following the success of that business participant and can pull them back for additional services as needed. Next slide. I'm going to hand it off and we're going to take a closer look at what those applications look like.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize for being off camera today, but I'm going to be going over some of the logistic and timeline pieces to the application process. So next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, Mass CEC and the workforce team are supporting a diverse approach to achieving the goals of the hub and spoke solicitation. This slide is just an illustrative tool to kind of detail out the types of application partnerships that we may receive, with the bottom line being hub proposals must have capacity to manage service plans, growth plans for individual businesses, staff hours, etc. If you're curious about reading more into these partnerships, please refer to page 13 of the RFP. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned previously, this webinar will be recorded and placed on the RFP website. For any additional process / overview application questions, please reach out to the RFP inbox. For more specific programmatic questions, it's definitely recommended to attend the Hub and Spoke office hours, which I will detail further in this presentation, with the final application deadline being April 25th. Next slide, please. So, before submitting on the April 25th deadline, applicants will be required to submit the highlighted attachments 1 through 3 in order to meet basic RFP eligibility for this RFP. Attachment 1 is the applicant's signature and acceptance form. Attachment 2 is the actual application form to be filled out. And then attachment 3 is the budget form. Each attachment has specific detailed instructions on how one should fill out this document. Attachments 1 and 2 need to be submitted separately. And attachment 3, which is the budget, must be submitted as an Excel. PDFs won't be accepted for the solicitation. And just to reiterate what was mentioned previously, Hub applicants are required to submit 2 separate application packets, one for the Hub and providing the core services, and one for the Spoke, demonstrating ability to provide sector-specific procurement/career navigation. Attachments 4, 5, and 6 don't have to be submitted. These are templates of what a grant agreement would look like, what our progress report would look like, and also what a memo of understanding would look like purely for reference. Applicants aren't required to submit an MOU, but they will be required to sign an MOU if awarded a grant. Therefore, we do provide a sample MOU as mentioned. So again, more information can be found on page 26 of the RFP, so please make sure to read the instructions thoroughly. Next slide, please. So this slide is going to show a visual example of what you can expect to see in attachment 3, the budget form. There are multiple sheets within this Excel that needs to be completed in order to meet our basic eligibility requirements. So the first sheet and outlined in bold is the program budget sheet. This is where an applicant is going to fill out all of the line items that are going to align with their proposed activities in their proposal. Please ensure that all line items related to, for example, personnel, direct program costs, or other matching are explained in the narrative column in this Excel. For example, listing out different roles and responsibilities for each staff listed. Matching is optional but encouraged as greater levels of cost share will be prioritized during the scoring and selection process for this RFP. In the small italic text here, we outlined that any funding over 50K that is intended to be used by a subcontractor needs to fill out a separate budget sheet using the program budget sheet B contained in this attachment 3 form. Additionally, applicants must submit a high-level organizational operating budget to propose specific program budget as a means to ensure organizational capacity for this proposal. And then the 2 bolded bullet points at the bottom are the project timeline and the go or no-go metric sheet visualized by the images on the right-hand side of the slide. So for the project timeline, applicants must fill out a project timeline that aligns with this proposed project budget, phases, as well as the accompanying narrative of the application. And the go or no-go metric table is how the workforce team in Mass CEC will be checking to ensure that a program is achieving its stated goals of enrollment or completion. So for example, if cohort 1 is on track according to our metric table, we can go or move on to the next round of training. If they're not achieving these goal metrics, we reserve the right to pause the progress and discuss what needs to be done before moving on to the next cohort. So again, please refer to the instructions listed out in the RFP proposal. Next slide, please. These are some examples of eligible versus I will go into non-eligible funding uses that applicants need to keep in mind while developing this proposal. So funds can be used for administrative or personnel costs, subcontractor, outreach and engagement efforts, direct support to business participants. And again, this is in line with the total program design listed in the Hub and Spoke application total. Next slide, please. So funding cannot be used for any costs associated with submitting this RFP proposal, activities before or after the award term, or any funding that is intending to only benefit a single business or a small number of underrepresented businesses. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual of our overall application timeline. Again, this information is all posted on the CUBS RFP webpage. So we will be holding a series of office hours that I will go into greater detail on the next slide, but final proposals are again due on April 25th. We will be holding interviews as applicable through April through May, with a final notification of award in June of 2025. Next slide, please. So the workforce team has general RFP office hours through April 22nd that are open to the public. That is drop-in, drop-out method to come in and ask questions related to all of our open RFP funding opportunities. However, for hub and spoke applicants who are thinking of applying to this RFP, we encourage you to join one or more of the 4 dates for these office hours listed on the slide to receive more specific and tailored information related to the hub and spoke model. We will have an expert attending these sessions that can answer your specific hub and spoke questions. Next slide, please. Next, I will run through the additional open funding opportunities to finish out this presentation. Next slide. So there are 4 funding opportunities, including the CUBS RFP that are open, that support adult 18 and older or equity populations. For more information, please scan the QR codes to find each application packet and RFP listed on each of these web page. Next slide, please. Additionally, we encourage you to check out funding opportunities posted by the student and young adult workforce team. These are all open and they include the Clean Energy Internship Program. If you go to the next slide, it'll also include the Technical Trades Work and Learning Program, and then finally the Climate Service Corps program, all found on the Mass CEC Workforce Funding site. So that wraps up our portion of the presentation. We will be taking a couple questions if we have some time. Thank you so much for attending and listening to our application presentation.
Thanks, Kira. So if folks have questions, you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom